Pope Francisco's Pope's dog invaded the papal conclave when Robert Prevost was about to be elected as the new pope. When they discovered the secret hidden on his collar, the Catholic world was shaken forever. A conspiracy, a divine mission, and a choice that will change the course of the Church. This is a story of loyalty, faith, and courage that will move your heart. Prepare to witness how God acts in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe to the channel. Leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Can you imagine what would happen if, at the most sacred moment of the Catholic Church, a small four-legged intruder defied centuries of Catholic tradition? What would you think if you knew that a simple animal carried with it a secret, capable of changing the destiny of the faith of millions of people around the world? The sun, still shy, was rising over the majestic dome of St. Peter's Basilica, casting long shadows over the nearly empty St. Peter's Square. While Rome slowly awoke to another day, within the Vatican walls, silence carried the weight of history. It was May 8, 2025, the third day of the conclave that began after the passing of Pope Francis, which occurred a little over 2 weeks prior, when the 88-year-old Argentine pontiff succumbed to a stroke followed by heart failure. At that moment, 120 cardinals were gathered in the Sistine Chapel, isolated from the outside world, committed to the sacred task of choosing the new leader of the Catholic Church. The first votes had already taken place, and the rumors escaping through the ancient walls whispered that the 69-year-old American Cardinal Robert Prevost was close to reaching the 2/3 of the votes needed to become the new pontiff. What no one could have predicted was that an unlikely being was preparing to interfere in this centuries-old process. In the shadows of one of the less guarded sacred corridors of the Vatican, a small dog with brown fur and deeply expressive eyes watched the movement of the Swiss guards intently. It wasn't just any animal. It was Francisco, the faithful companion who for years had slept at the feet of the deceased Pope's bed, a silent witness to his nightly prayers and confidant of his most intimate thoughts. Since his owner's death, Francisco had remained under the care of the Pope's personal secretary, Monsignor Luca Rossetti. However, that morning, the animal seemed possessed by a supernatural determination. He waited patiently until he identified the pattern of the Swiss guard's shift change. And then, in a swift movement that defied his advanced age, he darted through the marble corridors, his paws making a soft carpet of sounds that echoed through the centuries-old walls. "The Pope's dog escaped! Stop him!" The young guard's cry cut through the air like an arrow. But Francisco was too agile, moving as if he knew every inch of that sacred labyrinth, as if a higher power was guiding his steps. The guards ran after him, their ancient armor contrasting with the modern urgency of the situation. News of the dog's escape quickly reached the ears of Cardinal Angelo Bianchi, the Vatican's head of security, a 62-year-old man whose habitually serious face rarely allowed a smile. But at that moment, his eyebrows arched in genuine concern. "Find that animal before he causes any commotion," Bianchi ordered, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses. "The conclave cannot be disturbed by anything, much less by a dog." What he didn't reveal to his subordinates was his knowledge of the special relationship the animal had with the deceased pontiff. There was something about that dog that had always intrigued him, something that went beyond common canine loyalty. As the search intensified through the Vatican corridors, Sister Sarah Johnson, a 45-year-old American nun who worked on restoring ancient frescoes, heard the commotion outside the small chapel where she was meditating. Born in rural Texas, Sarah had grown up surrounded by animals and possessed a natural gift for communicating with them. Opening the chapel door, she found herself face to face with Francisco, who, panting, seemed to have found exactly the person he was looking for. "Hello, little one," she said softly, kneeling. "What are you doing running around alone, causing such a fuss?" Francisco looked at her with those eyes that seemed to carry centuries of wisdom. It wasn't just an animal gaze. There was something there, a spark of intelligence that made Sarah shiver. The dog approached hesitantly, and it was then that she noticed something unusual on his collar, a small golden medal worn by time. "What do you have there?" she murmured, slowly extending her hand to examine the object. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted the moment. Thomas Miller, a 28-year-old American seminarian who studied animal behavior when not immersed in his theological studies, turned the corner and stopped, surprised to see the scene. "Sister Sarah, I see you found our fugitive," he said in Portuguese with a heavy accent, approaching carefully. "The entire Vatican is looking for him." Sarah stood up, still gently holding Francisco's collar. "There's something strange. Here, Thomas. This animal isn't just scared or lost, he seemed determined." Miller knelt down, observing the dog's behavior. While years of scientific study formed hypotheses in his mind, his faith suggested something deeper. You know, in Catholic tradition, God often manifests through the simplest and most improbable messengers. It was at this moment that Francisco began to scratch insistently at the metal on his collar. The movement wasn't random. There was purpose, an almost human urgency. "He wants to show us something," Sarah concluded, leaning in to examine the metal more closely. Turning it over, she noticed an irregularity on the golden surface. "This isn't just a metal. It seems to be—" Her words were interrupted by the arrival of another person in the corridor. "A storage device," a female voice with a strong Italian accent finished. Gianna Ricci, a 35-year-old journalist covering the Conclave for a major newspaper in Milan, approached the trio. Tall, with black hair pulled back in a messy bun and sharp eyes that missed no detail, she shouldn't have been in that area of the UI's Vatican. "Forgive the intrusion, but I couldn't help but notice the commotion." Before Sarah or Thomas could respond, the sound of marching boots echoed down the corridor. The Swiss guards were approaching, and Francisco began to bark anxiously. "We need to get out of here," Gianna whispered. "That room there." She pointed to a discreet door, almost invisible in the ornate wall. "It's an old archive office, rarely used nowadays." With no time to question how the journalist knew that detail, Sarah picked up Francisco, and the three, along with the dog, slipped into the small room seconds before the guards turned the corner. The room was small, dusty, illuminated only by the faint light filtering through a narrow window. Old wooden shelves rose to the ceiling, filled with books and documents forgotten by time. "How did you know about this room?" Thomas asked, suspicious. Gianna smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's just say part of my job is knowing places where I can find information, or hide when necessary." Sarah, oblivious to the tension between the two, continued examining the metal. "It really looks like a disguised electronic device, but why? And how are we going to find out what it contains?" Gianna took a smartphone from her bag. "Maybe I can help. There are apps capable of reading certain wireless devices." As she spoke, she brought the phone close to the metal, and to everyone's surprise, the screen lit up with a message. "File found. Password required." The three exchanged tense glances. Outside, they could hear the guards passing, still searching for the fugitive dog. Inside the Sistine Chapel, just a few hundred feet away, the destiny of the Catholic Church was being decided, vote by vote. Why would Pope Francis put secret information on his dog's collar? Thomas asked, his voice a reverent whisper. "Maybe because a dog is the last place anyone would look," Gianna replied pragmatically. "Or maybe," she hesitated, her eyes fixing on Sarah, "maybe because he knew the animal would find the right person when needed." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She remembered her only encounter with Pope Francis, 3 months before his death. The pontiff was already frail, but his eyes still shone with that special light that touched the souls of all who knew him. He had noticed her restoration work and stopped to talk briefly. Francisco, the dog, had been by his side that day, and she remembered commenting on her way with animals. The Pope had smiled enigmatically and said something that at the time seemed merely kind, but now gained new meaning. God gives us gifts that one day may serve purposes greater than we imagine. "We need to figure out this password," Sarah said, determined. "It must be something important for the Pope to have taken such a precaution." The three began trying combinations, significant dates in the pontiff's life, names of important places, saints of his devotion. Each failed attempt increased the tension in the small room. Gianna's smartphone showed they had made dozens of attempts without success. Meanwhile, Cardinal Bianchi had been informed that the dog had disappeared along with 3 people. His security instinct immediately raised alerts. "Find them," he ordered his assistant. "But with discretion. I don't want to cause any more commotion than there already is." In the back of his mind, a concern was growing. Weeks before he passed away, Pope Francis had called him for a private conversation. "Angelo," the pontiff had said, his voice weak but firm, "there are things that cannot be said openly, even within these sacred walls. Watch Francisco, my little friend. He carries more than he appears to." At the time, Bianchi had interpreted the words as the delusion of a man on the verge of death. Now, he wasn't so sure. Inside the Sistine Chapel, the air was heavy with centuries of Catholic tradition and the tension of the present moment. The cardinals had just completed the penultimate round of voting for the day. Robert Prevost, the American cardinal considered the favorite, was now just 2 votes away from achieving the necessary majority. Tall, of strong build despite his 69 years, with perfectly trimmed gray hair and penetrating blue eyes, he emanated an aura of authority that many considered appropriate for the challenging times the Church faced. His main opponent, the younger, Italian Cardinal Marco Venturi, only 57 years old, represented a more progressive vision. He watched Prevost's advancement with growing concern. Something in his heart told him that the Church needed renewal, not a return to the stricter traditions Prevost advocated. "We're almost there," one of the American cardinals whispered to Prevost as they walked around the room during a brief break. "In the next vote, the white smoke will rise." Prevost nodded with a contained smile. Everything was proceeding as planned, or so he thought, unaware of the drama unfolding just a few feet away. Back in the small archive room, frustration was growing. Thomas ran a hand through his hair in a gesture of despair, while Gianna bit her lip, thoughtful. Sarah, however, remained calm, stroking Francisco, who seemed increasingly restless. "Maybe we're overthinking it," she finally said. Pope Francis always valued simplicity. It was then that the dog, as if understanding her words, began barking animatedly when she mentioned Francisco. Not the Pope's name, but his own name. "That's it?" Sarah asked, surprised. "His own name?" She typed Francisco into the device, but the screen continued to show the same error message. "No," Thomas murmured. "It's not the name itself. It's what it represents." His eyes lit up with sudden comprehension. Saint Francis of Assisi, the saint who inspires his name, the patron saint of animals. When Gianna typed Assisi, the smartphone screen changed. A file opened, filled with digitized documents, photographs, and a letter written by Pope Francis himself. The 3 leaned over the small screen, reading avidly. What they discovered made their hearts race. The documents revealed an unknown facet of Cardinal Prevost. Before his appointment as cardinal, he had engaged in secret negotiations with conservative political groups, promising changes in the social doctrine of the Church that directly contradicted the principles Pope Francis had fought so hard to establish. "He deceived everyone," Gianna whispered, her voice trembling with the implication of the discovery. He presented himself as a faithful follower of Pope Francis's vision, when in reality, he planned to dismantle his legacy as soon as he took the throne of Peter. The letter accompanying the documents was even more disturbing. Written by the pontiff weeks before his death, it revealed that he had discovered the truth about Prevost, but feared that the American cardinal's power and influence were too strong to be openly challenged. "I entrust this secret to my most faithful friend," the Pope had written, "in the hope that, guided by divine providence, he will find its way into the right hands at the right time. If you are reading this, know that you have been chosen by a power greater than us all." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "He knew," she murmured. "Somehow he knew his time was ending and that he needed to protect the Church." "But what do we do now?" Thomas asked, the evident anguish in his voice. "The conclave is almost over. In a few hours, Prevost could be the new pope." Francisco, as if sensing the urgency of the situation, began to frantically scratch at the room door, his barking gaining intensity. "He knows what to do," Sarah said, a strange certainty coming over her. "He always did." The moment she opened the door, the dog shot out into the corridors again. But this time, the three didn't try to stop him. Instead, they followed him, running as silently as possible towards the heart of the Vatican. Cardinal Bianchi, who was personally coordinating the search for the animal, saw the group rapidly approaching the restricted area that led to the Sistine Chapel. His first instinct was to stop them, but something in Sarah's determined expression made him hesitate. "Cardinal Bianchi," she called, recognizing him. "Please, we need you to trust us. It's about the future of the church." Bianchi looked from the supplicating face of the nun to the dog who now sat calmly at her feet, as if he had completed his mission by finding the cardinal. "Pope Francis told you to watch his dog," Sarah continued, intuiting the connection, "that he carried more than he appeared to." The cardinal's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "There's no time to explain," Gianna intervened, quickly showing him the documents on the smartphone. "The conclave needs to know this before the final vote." Bianchi quickly scanned the contents, his face visibly paling. As head of security, his primary loyalty was to the institution, but as a cardinal, his greater loyalty was to the truth and the principles the church represented. After a moment of internal agony, he made his decision. "Follow me," he ordered, guiding them through a side corridor that few knew. In the Sistine Chapel, the cardinals were preparing for the vote that would likely be the last. Prevost felt the weight of history on his shoulders, anticipating the moment he would be announced as the successor of Peter. What he didn't expect was the interruption that was about to occur. A bark echoed through the sacred chapel, breaking the solemn silence. All heads turned to see Francisco running down the central aisle, followed by Bianchi, Sarah, Thomas, and Gianna. "What is the meaning of this?" one of the older cardinals thundered, rising indignantly. "A violation of the conclave is unforgivable." Bianchi stepped forward, his voice firm despite the irregularity of the situation. "Eminences, I apologize for the interruption, but information has come to my attention that cannot be ignored before the final choice." Francisco, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, went directly to Cardinal Venturi and sat at his feet, staring fixedly at Prevost with something that looked like accusation in his canine eyes. A murmur of astonishment swept through the chapel. To many of the more traditional, superstitious cardinals, the animal's behavior seemed like a divine sign. To others, it was just an absurd distraction. Prevost stood up, his face a mask of controlled indignation. "This is an outrage. The sacred conclave cannot be interrupted because of an animal and baseless allegations." "The allegations are founded, Eminence," Bianchi replied, gesturing for Gianna to approach with the smartphone. "And they come from Pope Francisco himself." The chaos that ensued was inevitable. Some cardinals demanded that the intruders be removed immediately. Others insisted on examining the evidence presented. At the center of the storm, Francisco remained seated calmly at Venturi's feet, as if he had found his exact place in the universe. The dean of the College of Cardinals, a wise 92-year-old man who had already participated in 4 conclaves, finally imposed silence with a firm gesture of his trembling hands. "In nearly 2,000 years of history," he said, his voice weak but clear, "the Church has faced challenges, divisions, and moments of doubt. And in each of these moments, God has found ways to guide us, sometimes through the most unexpected paths." He looked at Francisco and smiled slightly. "It would not be the first time that God uses an animal to convey his will. Remember Balaam's donkey, which saw the angel before its master." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine, while Thomas murmured a silent prayer. Gianna, the journalist who had always prided herself on her skepticism, felt strangely touched by the solemnity of the moment. "We will examine this evidence," the dean decided, "and then we will continue with our sacred task. The truth must not be feared, but embraced, even when it comes from unexpected sources." When the documents were examined, The cardinal's reaction ranged from disbelief to anger, from disappointment to resolution. Prevost tried to defend himself, claiming the documents were fake, an attempt to manipulate the conclave. But the letter written by Pope Francisco himself, whose handwriting was unmistakable to many present, weighed as unquestionable evidence. The final vote that followed produced a very different result than expected hours before. Cardinal Marco Venturi emerged as the chosen one, taking the name Leo XIV in homage to the Pope who, in the 19th century, had opened the Church to the social issues of his time. When the white smoke finally rose from the chimneys of the Vatican, announcing to the world that a new Pope had been chosen, the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square exploded in applause. Nobody outside the Sistine Chapel knew exactly how the choice had been influenced by a small Pope's dog and his extraordinary act of loyalty. Hours later, when the new Pope Leo XIV appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica for his first Urbi et Orbi blessing, a surprise awaited the faithful. By his side, wearing a small red cape made especially for the occasion, was Francisco, the Pope's dog that many now believed had been an instrument of divine will. "Dear brothers and sisters," the new pontiff began, his voice echoing across the square. "God works in mysterious ways, through the most humble and unexpected instruments. This small animal reminded us today of a fundamental truth, that loyalty, courage, and love are values that transcend the barriers between species and speak directly to the essence of what it means to be a creation of God." In the crowd, Sarah, Thomas, and Gianna watched the scene with wide eyes. None of them were the same after the events of that extraordinary day. "Do you think Pope Francis planned all this?" Thomas whispered, still trying to grasp the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Sarah smiled, watching the Pope's dog who now seemed so comfortable in his new role beside the Pope. "I think he planted a seed and trusted that God would take care of the garden." Gianna, who was already mentally planning the article she would write, omitting certain parts of the story that the world might never be ready to know, added, "Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. This conclave will go down in history as the moment when a Pope's dog helped choose a Pope." The three laughed softly, united by a secret they would carry forever in their hearts. Above them, the Rome sky began to darken, the first stars appearing as silent witnesses to a day when the extraordinary manifested through the ordinary, reminding everyone that God's paths are indeed mysterious, sometimes furry, sometimes with four paws, but always guided by a love that transcends our human understanding. In the weeks that followed, Pope Leo XIV began implementing changes that honored his predecessor's legacy. Francisco, now a worldwide celebrity, became a symbol, adored by Catholics everywhere. Letters, toys, and even medals inspired by him arrived daily at the Vatican. Sarah returned to her restoration work, but now frequently received visits from the new pontiff and his canine companion. Thomas deepened his studies, now convinced that the relationship between humans and animals had spiritual dimensions that deserved to be explored theologically. And Gianna, although she never published the full story, wrote a children's book about a special Pope's dog who lived in the Vatican, capturing the imagination of children around the world. Cardinal Bianchi, recognized for his courage in a crucial moment, was appointed Secretary of State by the new Pope. In his first interview after the appointment, when asked about the rumors of a Pope's dog influencing the conclave, he merely smiled and said, "The history of the Church is filled with moments when the divine manifests through the ordinary. Our task is not to question the instruments God chooses, but to recognize His will when it is revealed, no matter how unexpected the form." And as for Francisco, he continued his life in the Vatican, sleeping now at the feet of a new Pope's bed, watching with those wise eyes as history continued to unfold. Sometimes, when Pope Leo XIV worked late in his office, the Pope's dog would sit near the window, looking at the stars, as if silently conversing with his former owner. On those nights, Vatican staff swore they could hear the whisper of an ancient blessing echoing through the sacred corridors. "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." And there was no heart purer than that of the small animal, who for a brief moment became the center of one of the oldest and most powerful institutions on Earth. This is a story of loyalty that transcends death, of courage that defies conventions, and of how sometimes the voice of God can be heard not in thunder or earthquakes, but in the determined bark of a pope's dog with a divine mission. And who knows? Perhaps somewhere in heaven Pope Francis is smiling, satisfied to see that his plan, as improbable as it was inspired, worked exactly as he had hoped, through the purest and most unconditional form of love that exists, the loyalty of an animal who became, for a day, the guardian of a pope's legacy and the instrument of divine will. Because in the end, it's not the powerful or the wise who change the world, but the small, the humble, those who love unconditionally and serve without questioning. And on that day in Rome, a simple pope's dog reminded us of this eternal truth, writing his name, or rather his paws, in the millennia-old history of the Catholic Church. Perhaps that is why, even today, visitors to St. Peter's Square claim that on certain sunny afternoons when the wind blows gently between Bernini's columns, they can hear the distant echo of a bark, a gentle reminder that faith, like love, sometimes comes in forms that defy our understanding, but that deeply touch our souls. And this, dear friends, is the true miracle. Not that a pope's dog helped choose a pope, but that through that extraordinary event, millions of people around the world were reminded that God, in his infinite wisdom, often chooses the most improbable instruments to fulfill his most sublime purposes. Because in the kingdom of God, even the smallest among us can become the greatest messengers of his truth and love. And in a world often dominated by cynicism and doubt, perhaps that is exactly what we need to remember, that the extraordinary can still happen, that the divine can still manifest among us, and that sometimes, just sometimes, a simple pet can become the hero of a story that transcends time and touches heaven itself. And so our story ends, not with the solemn sound of the Vatican bells, or with the pomp and circumstance of a papal ceremony, but with the soft snore of a pope's dog asleep at the feet of his new owner, perhaps dreaming of heavenly treats or the gentle stroke of his former master's hands. Because in the end, when the lights go out and the world falls asleep, what remains are not the titles, positions, or power, but the bonds of love that connect us to one another, whether human or animal, and to the Creator who made us all in his image and likeness. And in this universal feeling of connection and belonging, perhaps we can find the true message behind the miracle of the Pope's dog, that love, in its purest and most unconditional form, is the most powerful force in the universe, capable of transcending barriers, overcoming obstacles, and sometimes even influencing the course of history. May we all learn from Francisco, the Pope's dog who, for a day, became the instrument of divine will, and find in our own hearts the same loyalty, courage, and love that made him not just a man's best friend, but a symbol of hope for millions. Because in the end, it's not the grand gestures that change the world, but the small acts of love performed with great conviction. And in that, perhaps, lies the greatest lesson of all, that each of us, however small or insignificant we may seem in the eyes of the world, carries within ourselves the potential to be an instrument of divine grace, a bearer of light in times of darkness, a guardian of the legacy of love and compassion entrusted to us by He who created us. And this, my friends, is a truth worth remembering, a truth rediscovered thanks to a Pope's dog named Francisco and his extraordinary act of loyalty that, for a brief moment, changed the course of history and touched the hearts of millions around the world.